There are exactly 1,177 men entombed beneath the surface of Pearl Harbor right now. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally, their remains rest inside a battleship that has never been raised, has never been fully excavated, and never been given back to the living world. The ship sits in roughly 40 feet of water, visible from above, accessible by boat, surrounded by tourists every single day, and yet what lies inside it remains one of the most deliberately preserved mysteries in American military history. This is not a story about a ship that was lost at sea. This is a story about a ship that was found, cataloged, and then intentionally left exactly where it fell. And the deeper you look into why, the more questions begin to surface that no official briefing has ever fully answered. December 7, 1941 began as a Sunday. That matters, because a Sunday at Pearl Harbor in 1941 meant reduced readiness. It meant sailors sleeping in. It meant officers ashore. It meant the kind of institutional relaxation that only sets in when command believes, down to its bones, that a particular morning will pass like every other morning before it. At 7:55 a.m. local time, that belief was destroyed. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, minus 183 planes, launched from 6 carriers, positioned approximately 230 miles north of Oahu, descended on Battleship Row with a precision that to this day military historians describe as tactically extraordinary. Torpedo bombers skimmed the harbor at low altitude, releasing Type 91 aerial torpedoes specially modified with wooden fins to function in shallow water. High-altitude bombers released armor-piercing shells converted into bombs by attaching fins to the back of naval gun projectiles, allowing them to penetrate the deck plating of capital ships before detonating below. The USS Arizona, BB-39, was moored at berth F7 on the northeastern side of Ford Island. She was a Pennsylvania-class battleship. Commissioned in 1916, nearly 608 feet long, she had served in both hemispheres, had been modernized in the 1930s, and on the morning of December 7th carried a full complement of approximately 1,512 officers and enlisted men, many of whom were still below decks, still sleeping, still existing in the last minutes of a world that was about to end. At 8:06 a.m., a modified 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb dropped from a high-altitude Nakajima B-5N aircraft struck the Arizona near Turret 2. What happened next has been studied, reconstructed, and debated by naval historians for more than 80 years. The bomb penetrated the forward deck and detonated in or near the forward ammunition magazine, a compartment containing somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million pounds of black powder propellant used to fire the ship's 14-inch guns. The resulting explosion was not merely an explosion. It was an event. Contemporary accounts describe a column of fire rising hundreds of feet into the air. The entire forward section of the ship lifted out of the water before the keel broke and the vessel collapsed inward. The fireball was visible from miles away. The shock wave was felt by sailors on ships anchored hundreds of yards distant. The Arizona sank in approximately 9 minutes. 9 minutes. For context, the Titanic, struck by an iceberg in the North Atlantic, took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. The Arizona, the most catastrophically destroyed battleship in American naval history, was on the harbor floor before most of the men inside it had any meaningful chance to escape. 1,177 of the 1,512 men aboard were killed. The majority of them died in the initial explosion or in the fires that followed. Many were trapped in compartments below the waterline. Some were recovered in the immediate aftermath, but the majority, the overwhelming, staggering majority, were never recovered at all. And this is where the story begins to develop its true weight. Because in the years following the attack, as Pearl Harbor was cleaned up, as the war was fought and eventually won, as the wreckage was surveyed and some ships were raised and salvaged, a deliberate decision was made about the Arizona. A decision that was not made by engineers or salvage crews, but by people in rooms where grief and policy intersect. the ship would not be raised. The official explanation, repeated in countless Navy briefings and memorial documents, was that the cost and difficulty of raising the Arizona outweighed any practical benefit. The ship was too damaged to be returned to service. The salvageable equipment, guns, superstructure, mast components had already been removed. There was nothing left worth recovering from an operational standpoint. That explanation has always been accepted. But naval historians have occasionally pointed to a second, less discussed factor. Raising the ship would have meant disturbing the remains of 1,177 men. Many of those men were still legally listed as buried at sea, entombed within the vessel by the nature of their deaths and the conditions of the wreck. Moving the ship would have meant, in the most literal sense, excavating a mass grave. The Navy chose not to do that. And many of the survivors, many of the families, agreed. The Arizona was designated a war grave. It has remained one ever since. In 1962, the USS Arizona Memorial was dedicated above the wreck. 'Tis a white structure, 184 feet long, built over the midship section of the sunken battleship without touching it. Visitors arrive by boat. They walk through the memorial. They look down through the open floor sections into the water below. On clear days, you can see the outline of the hull beneath the surface. What most visitors don't immediately process, what tends to arrive as a slow, quiet shock, is that the men are still down there, right below their feet. The Navy maintains the wreck site as an active national cemetery. Surviving crew members of the Arizona who wish to be interred with their shipmates are still permitted to have their ashes placed inside the wreck upon death. As of the early 2020s, more than 36 survivors have chosen this. They return to their ship. They are down there now too, but the wreck itself holds more than remains. The Arizona still leaks oil. It has been leaking oil every single day since December 7th, 1941. Small black slicks rise from the hull and drift across the surface of the harbor in slow, thin ribbons. The National Park Service has monitored this phenomenon for decades. Engineers and environmental scientists have surveyed the wreck repeatedly to assess how much fuel oil remains trapped inside the hull. Their estimates have varied, but the most consistent figures suggest that somewhere between 500,000 and 5 million. Gallons of fuel oil may still be sealed within the Arizona's tanks more than 80 years after the attack. Consider the engineering implications of that alone. A ship that was catastrophically destroyed by the largest non-nuclear explosion ever to strike an American naval vessel that burned for days after sinking. That was partially dismantled in the years following the attack, and it still holds more than 500,000 gallons of oil in structurally intact tanks. Naval engineers who have studied the wreck describe a vessel that, despite its catastrophic damage, retains a structural integrity that has both protected the remains inside and complicated any future decisions about intervention. The hull is corroding. Slowly, but measurably. The oil leak rate has fluctuated over the decades. There are surveys that suggest the rate of leakage is increasing. And within those surveys lies a question that nobody in the conversation around Pearl Harbor particularly wants to articulate loudly. What happens when the hull finally fails? If the remaining oil escapes in a significant release event, whether through accelerating corrosion, seismic activity, or some other structural failure, it would represent an environmental catastrophe in a harbor that is now, 80 years later, a functioning military base, a tourist destination, and a living memorial. The fuel oil is heavy, viscous, damaging. Its release would affect the harbor ecosystem, the memorial site, and potentially the broader coastal waters around Oahu. The National Park Service, the U.S. Navy, and various environmental agencies have studied this problem. There have been reports. There have been assessments. There have been quiet conversations in governmental corridors about contingency plans. But the fundamental tension has never been resolved because solving the oil problem in any meaningful way requires intervening in a war grave in a manner that no law, no public consensus, and no political will has yet authorized. The ship holds its dead. The ship holds its oil. And the world watches the small black slicks rise to the surface every morning and chooses collectively not to decide. Beyond the oil and the remains lies a third layer of the Arizona story, one that receives far less attention in standard historical accounts, but which emerges when you begin reading the engineering surveys and archaeological documentation that has accumulated around the wreck since the 1980s. The interior of the Arizona has never been fully explored. Divers have entered the wreck. Archaeological surveys have documented significant portions of the interior, but large sections of the ship, particularly in the aft compartments, below the surviving gun turrets and in the lower engineering spaces, remain unexamined. Access is restricted. The structural integrity of certain sections makes penetration diving extraordinarily dangerous. Some compartments have not been entered since the day the ship sank. In those unexamined spaces, beyond the practical reach of diver-based archaeology, there are men whose specific fates remain technically unknown. There are compartments that were sealed, whether by the explosion, by damage, or by the sinking itself, that have simply never been opened. The official records identify 1,177 killed. Of those, a relatively small number were recovered and individually identified. The rest are listed as entombed aboard the vessel. What exactly entombed means, in a practical sense, has never been fully mapped. In 2017, the National Park Service and the Navy began a multi-year archaeological study of the wreck using non-invasive survey technologies, scanning sonar, photogrammetric imaging, remotely operated vehicles. Designed to create detailed three-dimensional documentation of the ship without disturbing it, the project generated extraordinary data. It produced models of the interior that no previous survey had achieved. And within that data, researchers began to develop a more precise understanding of how the explosion had traveled through the ship, which compartments had been destroyed immediately, and which had survived structurally intact. Some of what they found was expected. Some of what they found is still being interpreted. The nature of the explosion, traveling forward through the ship from the magazine detonation, created a damage pattern that left the aft sections of the vessel comparatively more intact than the devastated forward hull. Within those aft sections, the survey data revealed compartmental structures that had been sealed, not by damage, but by the simple physics of a ship sinking in shallow water. Hatches that had been dogged down. Spaces that had been closed off. Rooms that the water entered slowly enough and the silt accumulated quickly enough that their contents were effectively preserved in place. What those compartments contain in terms of artifacts, in terms of archival materials, in terms of anything beyond the structural, is not publicly documented in any detail. The Navy's position on the wreck remains consistent. It is a war grave. It is protected under federal law. Its disturbance requires authorization that does not exist, and that, given the political and emotional sensitivities involved, is unlikely to be sought. The surveys are conducted for documentation purposes, not excavation. What is inside will, for now, remain inside. But documentation is not the same as understanding. And the Arizona, sitting in 40 feet of water beneath one of the most visited memorials in the United States, visible from boats and accessible to recreational divers who must nonetheless observe strict, legal boundaries around the hull. The Arizona exists in a peculiar suspended state that defies easy categorization. It is a museum exhibit and a grave simultaneously. It is an environmental hazard and a sacred site. It is one of the most thoroughly documented wrecks in American history and one of the least fully explored. It leaks a slow black trace of itself into the harbor water every single day, as if the ship itself is still trying to communicate something that the surface world hasn't yet found the right language to receive. The men of the Arizona, the 1,177 who never came home, who never came up, who remain in the ship they served and died aboard, occupy a space in American memory that is simultaneously enormous and strangely incomplete. They are honored. They are memorialized. Their names are carved in marble. Every year on December 7th, ceremonies are held above them. The oil slicks drift past the White Memorial and out toward open water. But they have not been recovered. They have not been given a burial in the traditional sense of the word. They are present in a way that the dead almost never are, physically, materially, geographically specific, located on a map, accessible by boat on any given afternoon, and the oil keeps rising. It will keep rising for years, perhaps for decades, until the hull finally surrenders to time and salt water and the slow pressure of everything it has been carrying. And when that day comes, the harbor will face a reckoning that the surveys have been quietly anticipating for a generation. Whatever that reckoning looks like, it will happen above men who have been waiting, undisturbed. Since a Sunday morning in December of 1941, when 9 minutes changed everything, and the world chose, out of respect or necessity or simple inability to act, to leave them exactly where they fell. The question that lingers, the one that the oil slicks seem to ask each morning as they catch the light and drift toward open water, is whether leaving them there was the right choice, or simply the only choice anyone has ever been willing to make. Some ships go down in deep water, beyond reach, beyond recovery, beyond any practical possibility of return. The Arizona went down in 40 feet. It could, theoretically, be reached. It could, theoretically, be resolved. The fact that it hasn't been tells you something about the weight of what lies inside it. Look at those oil slicks the next time you see them. Follow them with your eyes as they drift. Think about what is directly below them. Then ask yourself whether a memorial is really a way of honoring the dead, or whether sometimes it is a way of not having to decide what to do with them.